I wonder if you have noticed the slab of bluestone, which is part of the garden bed, just opposite the door into the Zachariah room. It used to be one of the steps at the other end of the tower building, the steps which are used on the way down to the Science Centre. When I look at it, it's the way in which it is worn that captures my attention. Thousands of feet have worn the step down, hence its removal and replacement several years ago. But it remains as a reminder of all those who have walked these school grounds before us. I think of those people at this time every year when we remember former students of the college who've died on active service. I think of Reggie Bree and William Skeen, who died during the South African War around the turn of the 20th century. There's a grand photograph of Bree in the college archives and a brass plaque in the entrance hall. His death obviously shocked those he had walked around with only a year or so earlier. I think of the Hamilton Collegians who died during the Gallipoli campaign: Alan Cordner, Ted Henty and Les Connor. The Cordner family had to wait over a year after the 25th of April 1915, when Alan was killed, to receive confirmation of his death. What a hard time that must have been. Henty and Connor were killed on the same day when there was a charge straight out of the trenches of the machine guns at Walker's Ridge. By the end of the First World War, a further 16 former students of the college had died whilst serving. Some of these, like John Fenton's, were particularly gruesome, the result of being gassed. Others were killed in battle or died of wounds or from injuries received whilst serving. I think of them too, young lives cut short. Over 100 others had served. Take a moment next time you're in the entrance hall to look at the names on the honour board. Most served in France, the Western Front being the place where many historians argue the real ANZAC legend was consolidated and where the ANZACs played a major role in the ultimate victory. Of course, that victory led to a treaty which imposed harsh restrictions on the vanquished. The sense of humiliation this caused was one of the reasons why a second worldwide conflict broke out only 20 years later. 5 former students were to die in this new war, and well over 100 former students' names can be found on that war's honour board. Somehow, perhaps because there was no school magazine published during the Second World War, we do not know their stories so well, but I think of them too. Former Prime Minister Paul Keating once argued that the efforts of the new ANZACs during the Second World War deserve more recognition. Kokoda, the Coral Sea, Darwin, the Pacific Campaign were all areas fought over when the safety of Australia was imperilled. Keating suggested we should spend more time focusing on those battles, as they were about Australia's immediate national security, rather than for the cause of empire. So I wanted to focus today on the contribution of one former student who served in that Asia-Pacific sector of the Second World War. He is the most recent Old Collegian to die in the service of his country. Stephen Gerard Allnut was born in Penola on the 14th of December 1904. His parents were George Stephen and Beatrice Gerard Allnut. He attended the college from February 1918 to December 1919 and later went on to Brighton Grammar School. His home is recorded as Cadnook at Harrow, and his younger brother Geoffrey was here at the same time he was. Only a little is known about Stephen's exploits here, but he was in Form 4A and was dux of that form in 1919. He became an accountant after he finished school and later married and lived in Brighton. When the Second World War broke out, the first enlistments were transported to the Middle East, where it was expected they would come to the aid of the Empire after completing their training. Battles occurred in the Mediterranean region and the deserts of northern Africa, as well as in Europe. The tide of the war in Europe was not initially positive for the British Empire and its allies. At the same time, the threat of Japanese expansion was being increasingly felt back home, and the Australian government felt it was necessary to seek the return of its forces. This was not achieved quickly, as the British government saw the defence of the United Kingdom as a priority and relied on the security offered to the Southeast Asian region by the fortress at Singapore. This, it was confidently predicted, would halt the Japanese advance. As the main force was not immediately able to return home to help defend an increasingly nervous Australia, reinforcements were sought for the garrison at Singapore as the Japanese advance continued. So with that threat increasing, after 2 years of service in the citizen forces, and at the age of 36 and a half, Stephen Allnut signed up. He spent 5 months at Royal Park in Melbourne and in Bendigo, where he appears to have completed largely clerical duties at the training depot. In August 1941, he was appointed acting corporal. On the 6th of January 1942, Allnut was posted to a unit of the Australian Army Ordnance Corps, which 4 days later embarked on a troopship in Sydney. On the 26th of January 1942, Australia Day, he disembarked at Singapore, a place under great pressure from the Japanese advance. Historians have written that those last-minute replacements arrived untrained and ill-equipped for battle. Fighting in the city occurred from the 8th to the 15th of February, when the Australian forces and their allies were surrendered. Allnut was reported missing on the 16th of February. Amongst the personnel records you can look at on the Australian War Memorial website is a letter written by Allnut's wife Margaret on the 20th of April 1942. She's obviously worried, fearful perhaps. The last news she had heard from her husband was in a letter dated the 3rd of February. He would have been in Singapore by then, and she'd also received a wireless cable on the 7th of February. Since then, a period of 2.5 months, she had heard nothing. Her letter almost begs the officer in charge for information, and it's likely he was unable to provide any news. But at some stage, it became known that Stephen Allnut was a prisoner of war, and he was in a POW camp in Borneo. Whilst there's a small group of students and teachers here who will all have wonderful memories of Borneo from last December, we're all well aware, I think, of the hardships prisoners of the Japanese at the time faced. Another old collegian, the nurse Betty Jeffrey, wrote a book, White Coolies, about her experience as a prisoner, and her bitterness at her captors and their harsh treatment of those who had surrendered is evident. We can only assume that Allnut's experiences were similarly unpleasant, especially given the location in Borneo where he was held. Sandakan is infamous for the deaths of nearly every one of the 2,500 British and Australian prisoners held there. At a memorial service in 2010 to commemorate those who had died at Sandakan, Governor-General Quentin Bryce told their story. For 3 years they laboured at gunpoint to build a military airstrip that would, in the end, be abandoned. They were beaten violently and repeatedly. They were fed scarcely and poorly. Over time, they became severely malnourished and often dangerously ill. Allnut is recorded as having suffered malaria. Later, Bryce said, those still alive were hauled from near collapse and coerced by rifle butt along a gruelling mountainous track. For 260 kilometres, they staggered and reeled, many without boots, all without tolerable rations. Those who could navigate the nightmare no longer were murdered or discarded along the way. The Sandakan marches are infamous. It's unclear if Stephen Allnut died of his malaria or whether he perished on the marches. But given his death is officially recorded as the 20th of May 1945, after the marches had begun, it seems likely he was forced some of the way across Borneo. It's certainly clear that his was not an easy death. Indeed, the Labuan Memorial Cemetery, where he's commemorated, is for those with no known grave. Malnourished, mistreated, beaten, sick, dying in the jungle, perhaps alone. Think of Stephen Gerard Allnut when you next walk past that old step in the grounds, and give some thoughts to the sacrifice he and so many others have made to allow us to live lives of hope and promise.
R.S. Bree, W. Skeen, E.F.R. Balderson, G.E. Broughton, R.A.E. Carter, F.E. Cochrane, J.L. Connor, J.A. Cordner, J.W. Fenton, F.R. Green, E.E. Henty, J. Houston, W.T. Hutchison, H.M. Merton, J.S. McKechnie, T. Ord, P.B. Osborne, H.L. Rintel, A.J. Trangmar, V. Tucker, F. Waring, C. Cameron, T.T. Laidlaw, A. Tatlock, R.J. Miller, S.